Thanks very much for joining us, Eric. It's really good to have you here. I was going to bring a bit of paper from over there and decided not to. You've seen the questions that we talked about. We'll wing it. So when I met Eric, he was using this word that I had never heard before. And the word was curation. Well, obviously I'd heard the word curation, but just not in the context of open source software.
That's because I made it up.
Okay, well, I bought it. I bought it, and I've been telling everybody it's the hot word in open source software since then. Now, do we start there, or do you want to go back? Maybe we should go back and look at where we've come from. So how did you get involved in open source software?
Well, Bomani mentioned the CNCF, and I actually helped start that foundation. That was because I was deeply involved in Kubernetes, and we decided to make Kubernetes open source, and I'm very grateful we did. So my journey for real open source, I'd used it before, contributed some, but really started with Kubernetes and trying to make sure that was open source, including even the trademark, which was another whole story we could talk about. But that was really the purpose of the CNCF, was to have a place that held the trademark that wasn't Google, because that actually makes an extra level of open that's relatively unusual. And we needed that because Kubernetes has been a huge change, but as big as Google is not big enough by itself to cause that change. That kind of change needs a whole bunch of players and a whole bunch of people, and open source was the way to achieve that. So did lots of work on Kubernetes, many KubeCons, all kinds of things in and outside of Google. That led eventually to me realizing sometime in my 2018 that the world depended on Kubernetes, and despite great efforts by many people, it wasn't as trustworthy as it ought to be.
Okay.
Right? And I would say that essentially about all open source. It's not as trustworthy as we actually currently trust it.
So what do you mean by that? Let's unpack that a little bit. So all open source isn't as trustworthy as we trust it.
What's happened is, open source, especially as you said in your keynote, in the last 5 years, has really exploded in its adoption and use. And there's a kind of a fundamental disconnect that I want to talk about that leads to the need for curation. And that disconnect is everyone understands that open source is free, and free software makes people vastly more productive because of all the work you don't have to do if you're reusing open source, right? But it says literally on every file pretty much, this comes as is, use at your own risk. That is the nature of the license. So that's the producer side of open source is, here's a whole bunch of fantastic free software, and you should build on it. And in fact, if you don't build on it, I would argue you cannot be a competitive company. Right? You can't replicate all that stuff internally in a proprietary way. Yeah. So you have to use it. Every nation has to use it. Every government has to use it. British government uses a ton of open source. They are consumers. Right? So that's the producer side, is lots of free software as is. Right? The consumer side historically was smallish software developers or companies, including Google, not so small, that were using open source and kind of understood that contract. I think what's happened in the last 5 years is a huge number of new entities are using open source with relatively little understanding of that contract. And in fact, in Log4j, you mentioned there's a whole set of things where lawyers from consumers would call up people and say, oh, you have vulnerabilities in your software. What's your plan to fix them? And I need a fix in 24 hours.
Yeah, it's something that I've really seen in the last 12 months. I've done some work with the UK public sector, and I've been interviewing people. And there's a tendency to follow my lawyer's definition, right, which is a lawyer's definition. So it's software where you've got the source code, you've got an OSI approved license. Even that last bit can be a bit controversial, but the UK government follows it. Tick. So then you get someone to build your software. And what do they do with it? They throw it over the wall, they stick it on GitHub, they have no documents, they have no plans, they have no community, they have no contributions, they have no maintenance, they haven't thought about how they're going to keep it going. Who's going to use that, right? So you're just creating a wasteland in GitHub of software without really achieving your goals. And what we've seen with the public sector in particular is the reason they use open source, 2 reasons. The first is that they want to avoid vendor lock-in. But of course, they've contracted with someone to create this software for them. And when you ask what the maintenance plan is, they'll say, oh, I've got a 3-year contract. How's that open source? So you have that, and then nobody's going to touch that code because it hasn't been well curated or well managed. And what that then means is that you've wasted the money that you thought was going to create something that was be reused and recycled. So there's just this lack of detailed understanding.
So now that we have open source everywhere, as you said, open source has won, right? It's in every cloud, every important digital service, every government. It's presumably in lots of places you don't think about in electrical grids or water supplies or oil pipelines. Right? These are things we depend on, and they depend on open source. What is the transitive trust there? How do we make that work, right? So we need, in general, where we have to go is consumers of open source have to understand that it's on them to fix security. That's not the way I'd like it to be, but that's literally what the contract says. So if you don't like that contract, you need some help from somewhere, right? And so really, where I came from thinking about curation is we have a fantastic supply of as-is software, and we have consumers, including governments, that need supported secure software, right? Where it's not as-is, right? You have to bridge the as-is to not as-is gap. Right? And that's really the curator, so to speak, you can think of as the group that's going to take as-is software and convert it to supported software. Now, this is not a completely novel concept. This is essentially what happens with a Canonical or a Red Hat. When you get a license from them, at least for the lineage packages you use, they will provide support and security patches. The problem is that's a tiny fraction of all of the open source software that people use, and you actually need curation for your Apache web server and your Log4j and your Spring Java libraries and all kinds of things. So there's this gap, which is how are we going to cause creation to exist so that we can have broad, powerful consumers that can't really even take the responsibility of doing all the patching and securing of open source, right?
And
that's a lot of work.
Immediately brings a couple of things to mind. So the first thing you're talking about is contracting, not so much for a license, but contracting for services from a Canonical, a Red Hat, a Google, a Microsoft, whoever it's going to be. So you're looking at that contract, and the difference, I think, between regulation and contract is that you can't regulate open source in certain ways. Open source developers create, they license, they distribute, it's there. But you can give them money. You can buy something from them, whether it's Red Hat, Canonical, or an individual. You can shift the risk through a contract, and you can get them to do some of that work, some of this curation for you.
Yes.
And frankly, for the UK, if we're a centre of excellence, and there's a lot of money to be made in this space, you would think that that would be driving our policy forward towards curation.
It's kind of why I'm here, because I believe curation is the only path forward. I think it's honestly an existential threat to open source. If we don't figure out how to cause a path for secure software to get to the consumers like electrical grids, right, open source will simply not be an option, right? Security is going to be a must-have requirement, so we have to make it possible to have a path that includes security without saying, volunteers should do more, right? That's not the answer, right? The answer has to be something that's actually financially sustainable. And I'll give you an analogy that I think, when you hear it, might change your views a bit, which is you wouldn't expect a neighborhood to fix their own roads. You wouldn't expect a neighborhood to fix their water supply or their electrical grid. Right? What these things share in common is they are all public infrastructures. And I would argue open source is a well-known public good, but it's actually at this point also a public infrastructure, because so much of the economy of the US and the UK and many other countries are indirectly built on open source. Right? We cannot be as productive as we are. We would not have the rate of innovation that we actually have if we were not building on open source. Right? So that is, if you think of it as a public infrastructure, you say, well, of course I wouldn't just build a road and then never maintain it, right? That would be a waste. That is basically what we do with open source that is unsupported. It's built well, at least at first. If it's not supported, it will eventually degrade, right? That's what happens to all open source if it's not the new hot thing, right? And so, again, you can't ask people to just magically fix things. You can't have your lawyer call Log4j folks and say, fix it. You have to fix it quickly. Right? You don't get to ask that question as a consumer. Now, if you had curated Log4j, you could tell your curator, you need to fix Log4j for me. And the curator would do that. And in fact, that happened in various cases where Log4j was indirectly used through curation.
Yeah, and I think that works in different ways, right? So you can get a provider who does it for you. You can learn the skills in-house, and one of the beauties of open source is that by contributing, you learn those skills yourself. And you can get to a stage in curation where when Log4j happened, ARM's response was 1 hour. So they knew within an hour, everywhere in their infrastructure that Log4j was going to impact it, and were able to designate the response levels to that. So the curation done in the right way can take you forward dramatically. But I think, Eric, we should shift and we should ask the audience what they want to talk about. We have some more guests who've come in from the US as well, so I want to keep us roughly on time. So I'm going to say let's have 15 minutes of questions from the audience, if you've got questions. So straight to the lady in the front row. Adam, up there, okay. Keep your hand up.
Thank you. For me, Dr. Nicholas Stingley, University of Basel. For me, curation, yes, but part of curation is accountability. And although we're talking about no legal liability for the creators, I think we need to have whole pipeline accountability as part of the curation and acceptance of a moral responsibility about what we do with data. And I mean responsibility as a privilege and an honor, not as a threat. So curation, accountability, whole pipeline, including data creators. What do you think?
I would say the main purpose of a curator is to be accountable, right? It's the opposite of as is, right? And by definition, when you are using something from a curator, they're responsible, or at least they should be, for the whole pipeline, as you say.
Exactly.
Right? And so that is the service you're paying them for. And again, this is not a new model. I'm just broadening it and also trying to explain it in kind of a new way, which is it's bridging this gap. Right? The gap has existed for a long time. It didn't matter 5 years ago because we weren't using open source in all these critical systems. Now it matters. We have to address it. I don't see, frankly, any other solution than some form of curation. Now, it won't be a single curator. Google does a little bit of curation, something called Assured OSS, Red Hat, and Canonical I've mentioned. A company like a Databricks does essentially curation for their own software, which is Spark, right? So all the companies that have basically built around a certain part of the open source ecosystem, they are curators. Maintainers are welcome to be curators. You can be both the maintainer and the curator, right? You can be the creator where you take no responsibility, that's not really me, but you don't have no legal liability. And you can also, the same person can choose to play the curator role and say, for, a different fee or a different structure, I will make custom changes for you. And lots of maintainers do this. Google pays OpenSSL maintainers, for example, to make important bug changes to OpenSSL, because that is a critical package, right? And I started a foundation called OpenSSF, which is part of the Linux Foundation, Open Source Security Foundation. The goal of this group is basically to help from the bottom up to secure critical packages, working with governments and many companies. And we were the group that hosted the last White House summit to try and address these issues after the Biden cybersecurity order. So there's lots of action going on, but we have still a long ways to go.
And I think that's the inspiration for what we're doing today, is to try and broaden the conversation and create more of a joined up approach globally. Most of the conversation I've seen, at least so far, has been in the US, and it's really important to start to engage with that. And I think it's also important to recognize that we're not talking about maintainer responsibility changing. Nobody here in the DCMS consultation that I read out to you earlier, they definitely are not looking at changing something and putting burden on the maintainers, which would be inappropriate.
Yeah,
there's no doubting.
That's why I try to use these as a role. Maintenance is a role, curation is a role. The same person can play both roles, but they don't have to.
So I'm going to move. There's Adam, there's a gentleman at the back, Mike Schwartz, and one over there, and that's probably going to run us out of time, and I'm going to not interrupt Eric so that we get through these, if I can.
Hi there, Adam Fowler. I'm a director of product at DataVid, but I used to do digital contact tracing. I was also the chair of the Linux Foundation Public Health TAC last year, and that kind of imploded. And the reason it kind of imploded was to do with this curation point. So I just wanted to ask if you think there's a different model that doesn't require £20,000, £60,000 membership fees for companies who directly employ open source developers, and if we could do almost a Raspberry Pi Foundation-esque model to act as a curator, and then they can sign commercial contracts, get donations, get funding from government, and then directly employ open source contributors like these Log4j guys and other packages. Do you think that could work, or am I crazy?
I think right now we're in a period where we need to try all the experiments. We need to try paying maintainers. We need to try paying foundations. Both of those we're actively trying. We created a new foundation. There's a CNCF security group that at least knows that space and could do some curation for certain things. There's companies like a Databricks that could do curation narrowly for things that they're already curating essentially in principle. There's SIs that could do curation of curation, right? Because they already have the customer relationships. I think we need to try all these things, right? Because it's not clear exactly, I don't think it's a single best model. So it's not cheap, right? I think that people kind of focus on open source as free, but it's not free, right? It's free if it's never going to change and you never need to patch it, then maybe it's free. Good luck with that. The whole point of open source is speed up innovation. Speed up innovation, things are going to change.
Yeah, it's very frustrating.
This is very fundamental that we have to actually, one way or another, pay the piper to get maintenance done.
Yeah, we go to the person at the back of the room, but it is one thing that in all of our surveys that we do at OpenUK, and I hope you'll all complete that this year, it's so frustrating that the number one reason to use open source is cost saving. It's just the wrong reason, and it's what everybody says. So at the back of the room.
Hi there, Andy Bennett, Register Dynamics. So, this is an open source conference, so I think everyone will support me if I ask who other than the biggest customers ever really gets the support they want from a vendor. At least we're kind of upfront about our warranties on our code. And in my experience, with both open source and commercial software, simple things like security patches, the bottleneck is always right at the last end of the pipeline, actually getting it deployed to an appliance or a piece of software. And it's not about the software at that point. It's not about the technology. It's about very specific products, very specific processes and practices in that particular company that are minutely different from everywhere else.
Yep.
And so, as open source software, don't we have more of an advantage to offer like a curated marketplace of different support for different people there? Isn't it more about those procedures rather than about individual software packages?
Well, it has to be both, because to be a modern competitive company in pretty much any industry touched by software, which I would argue is almost any industry, right? You actually have to be able to deploy software relatively quickly, and most cannot, right? We're not at the point now where most companies can roll out a change in a day or even a week. Right? If it takes you 3 months to make a database update, and that is not an exaggeration, you cannot respond to security vulnerabilities. You cannot, right? And if your competitors can respond in a day or a week, and you can respond in 3 months, in 5 years, you won't be the same market share, right? So this is moving this way to get to a kind of development pipeline that actually enables you to deploy changes. But I would argue that's mostly orthogonal to whether it's proprietary or open source. But you're right, open source can help with that for a variety of reasons. In particular, when something comes along and there are fixes like Log4j, there were many fixes available quickly. So if you had the ability to deploy them, you're done, right? Most people did not have that ability.
Go over to Mike. And in the OpenUK reporting that we did, all companies in the UK that responded that were under 3 years old said they used open source. Every single one of them. Mike.
Hi, I'm Mike Schwartz. I'm the founder of Glue, and I'm the host of the Open Source Underdogs podcast.
Nice.
So my problem with curation is that it means that somebody's going to pick winners and losers. And with 4 to 5 million open source packages, forget about GitHub repositories, who picks those winners and losers? So do you think it's maybe time to become more creative in creating open source licenses that require if people are going to graze on the open source commons, maybe they need to check a box to say, I was here, so we can at least see not who the people are, but how many people are actually grazing on this commons pasture, and can we maybe creatively figure out how to tie that into the license? Do we need more innovation on the license side to maybe address this problem? Right. So we have an algorithmic way to know what to curate.
I would separate. There's two issues there. Do we have some idea of what to curate? I think we do. We have a fair number of signals, including data from GitHub on what's actually used, or Maven has tons of data, what's downloaded. Is it perfect data? No, but there is lots of data. Do I think we should explore license changes that enable curation? Probably. I don't see why not. I think, again, we're in the period we should try lots of experiments and see what works. So that is an avenue to try for sure. I think to the broader comment of winners and losers, I don't want there to be a curator, right? I don't want you to get all your stuff from Google. That's not what I'm saying at all. We're curating a small amount of stuff. Basically, we curate the stuff that we're already using internally, so we're already doing the patches. So there's no reason not to make that available, right? And we try to upstream those things, by the way, also, but that can take some time. So we'll make them available immediately, upstream them when we can. But yes, there should be lots of curators, and there should be curators of curators, right? And there should be specialist curators. I'm talking to financial services groups about them doing curation for stuff that industry shares. So it's an industry vertical curator, because it's to their mutual interest to all do that work together versus each company separately fixing the log4js that they need to fix individually. That's a waste of money. So there's lots of models here, but it should be competitive in the sense that you have many options for curation. That's the right long-term solution.
So we're going to come down here to Christian, and there's one over there. Do you want to do the one over there with they first? Yeah, okay, let them go first. But just before we move on, this is the thing that when I met Eric, I was being very animated about, and it wasn't a bar. And we didn't agree entirely, but we do agree and we disagree. So Mike, I don't think the license solution is the right one. I feel very strongly about it because one of the essences of open source is that the way it's distributed, everybody is able to use it. There is no royalty, no license fee, no penalty to use it. And I think there is an ecosystem shift required, and that ecosystem shift, I think, will be something we talk about in the next panel session, but joined up international government funding. And we need to see that, I think, as a public-private enterprise. I'm giving away the ending of the story, I suppose, but I think we need public-private initiatives. I think we need to see companies investing in open source and doing it with governments. And I have a model of stewards who would do the work of curation, but it would be something that's also a digital public good. So we don't entirely agree, but I think we get to the same conclusion, just in slightly different ways. So the lady at the back.
Not lady.
I was told it was lady, sorry.
All right. Thomas Steenbergen, EPAM. I'm active in the Do Group and also in OpenSF. One of the problems I actually see when you talk about curation, I actually look at one step beforehand. One of the major issues when I talk to a lot of companies, even if they know the open source they use 20,000, 40,000, 100,000. So their main question is, where do I actually start? And what are the things that are critical to me? That's where they're actually struggling. If they know it, that's where they're struggling. So I would love to know your views, like, how would you recommend those companies to start?
Well, first, it's worth pointing out that most companies don't actually know what they use. And if you ask them what do they use Log4j, they couldn't tell you, right? And that's true even for Google. For our kind of main production stuff, we have excellent data on where we didn't really use Log4j because we have our own logging systems, but had we used it much, we would have known exactly where it was and we could have quickly fixed it, and we did, right? In a whole bunch of other places, including Kubernetes or open source, we have less clarity in all the things that are used. We just don't have the same hygiene, frankly, for how things are built and monitored. And that's not atypical. Most companies, again, don't have an inventory of where something like Log4j is actually running. So the first question I would say is, do you even know what you use? The second thing I would say is, do you have a reasonably good bar before you adopt a piece of open source technology? And I would say most companies don't have a bar at all, meaning that even Kubernetes, when I got into this journey, it had at the time something like 1,200, 1,500 dependencies, many of which were clearly not trustworthy. But again, someone in the community brought them in. I'm sure they had good intentions, but the bottom line is there was no bar for what should be included or not. And we actually reduced that over time to about 700 dependencies and got rid of the ones that looked the most risky, right? So that's a process you have to go through, right? And you think of some of the classic attacks, like the one that there was a JavaScript attack that was basically a little tiny library that converted, I kid you not, milliseconds to seconds. And someone had a package for this, and that package became corrupt. Right? You shouldn't be using a package from milliseconds to seconds, right? And in general, you shouldn't be using packages that are small and unsupported from people you don't know, right? And that is widely practiced today, even in important pieces of software, right?
So we're going to
part
go
of it.
to the last question. This subject is one that we could talk about for a long time, and we will. And there is a panel session with Sarah Novotny and Eric, Sarah from Microsoft, this afternoon at 1:30 in the Government Law and Policy Room. So if anybody wants to delve into that more, we can do more of it then. Christian, last question.
So Christian Patterson from OpenUK. My question is more of a comment, really, but you can take that as a question as well. Obviously, security is really important, and you guys have been talking about curation as one of the aspects to having a more secure pipeline. But doesn't that, in some ways, shift the responsibility from the user or the enterprise that's using the open source? And what I mean by that is, as a company that's using any software or doing anything these days, you are responsible for the security of your operations, not the pipeline. Now, you can help the pipeline, that's for sure, but the responsibility is on you. So it feels like we're trying to shift this discussion to see how we can move that responsibility further down the pipeline. And I think the pipeline, the responsibility is always with the using enterprise, who can then take part in and help upstream.
I think it's fine to say the responsibility remains with the using enterprise. Let's just agree to that 100%. But the normal practice for all industries and all vendors is for the things you don't think you can support directly, you by contract get your vendors to support those things. Whether that's HR or legal services or marketing and advertising. And these companies, most governments can't handle the actual workload of patching and maintaining the open source they use. So they need to outsource that. They're still responsible if it breaks. Their liability is not going to disappear. But just like many other parts of their business, they can pay a vendor to take on that risk and liability legally, contractually, right? And they can in fact do other things too. Cyber insurance should be affected. If you're using curated software, your cyber insurance premium should be lower.
Christian, I'm sorry. Christian, I'm sorry. We can't. We have to go to the next panel. I'm really sorry. But you can go up to 1:30 this afternoon and have this conversation at length. We will have quite an open panel this afternoon. I really have to wrap it up because we've got other guests and I'm slightly late, so I'm sorry. Eric, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure having you. Thank you.
Great to see you again.